Hello, welcome to China Dialogue. China has released its white paper on responding to climate change, China's policies and actions, saying that the international community needs to respond with unprecedented ambition and action while facing these unprecedented challenges in global climate governance. Has China delivered its promises by 2021 accordingly? What can this world do in front of immigrant threat? To get a closer look at what China has been doing to prevent climate change, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor John Gong of the University of International Business and Economics, Wu Changhua, Executive Director of a Professional Association for China's Environment, and Isabel Hilton, CEO of China Dialogue. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Changhua, I will start with you, the white paper. So 10 years ago, there was a white paper on the actions and policies of the Chinese side in responding to climate change. Now, with the latest release of the white paper, so what's your takeaway? What's the major points of this documents?
Well, compared to 10 years ago, today's white paper probably is the most comprehensive and also in-depth summary and overview of how far or the journey the country has traveled in terms of decarbonizing its economy and the infrastructure and the energy system in particular. And also it laid out actually the way forward, and with particularly looking into next 40 years, but particularly with the time-bound commitments into 2025, 2030, and of course leading up carbon neutrality goal before 2060. Compared to 10 years ago, this is more comprehensive. We can see clearly sort of the difference. 10 years ago, we were not really in the current mood in terms of looking into capping or carbon neutrality at all. We were busy with trying to figure out how to address the intensity issues there, how to make sure, while the economy continued to grow and we would be able to decouple, energy consumption and carbon, emissions there. And if you look at it, the strategic level at the national level, definitely it was not that sophisticated at all. So back then it was much more sort of narrower focused, but today it's more comprehensive. And of course, if you look at the specific targets there, and it's more like a track record in terms of, the target we set, back in Copenhagen, and then of course the Paris Agreement leading up to 2020. And then of course, now we have specific timeline targets for the next 40 years. So in terms of policy tools, the in-depth or sophistication, you could see, the quite a difference. And also I think the evidence and data availability also tells the difference. Back then we didn't really have much knowledge or data, but today we have much more comprehensive data and evidence to prove, the achievements, the journey traveled, but more importantly, a more integrated national strategy, really putting the carbon capping and the carbon neutrality goal embedded at the center of government policy making to guide actually the next 40 years actually travel to decarbonize China's energy system and its economy.
Well, John, based on what Changhua has said, to give you a sense of like over the past 10 years, in terms of in terms of this awareness, policy, the action, it give you a sense of like a maturity on the Chinese side, how to achieve those goals and how to set the targets and how to realize those targets. Is that the sense you have?
Yeah, sure, of course. My takeaway from reading this document is that it tells a lot about the details of how China goes about implementing these goals. It's not something that's sort of a more of a rhetorical statement. China's really doing it. It tells a lot of details about how to actually achieve these goals. For example, we put these goals down to minister level objectives for the provincial level, at city level, at the autonomous region level. So these are really things that are being calculated down to the leadership of each province. And also there are a whole slew of details about how to do this. I mean, I'm really some of it is actually also news to me. I didn't know how to actually they're being implemented. Now I have a better understanding of how they implement it. Another very important takeaway from this is that it also quantifies in a quite bit of a details about what we have achieved so far. You mentioned carbon use intensity. That's a tremendous reduction from close to 2 tons of CO2 emission per 10,000 RMB of GDP down to close to 1.2 tons. I mean, that's almost like a let's say 70 to 80 40% reduction right there. So that's a huge achievement at this point. So I think it gives a lot of information, gives a lot of details, and at least I think it can be referred to as a document regarding the issue of how exactly and how China has been going about achieving these goals.
Mm-hmm. Well, John said it very well. The documents are harder to read probably for people who are busy with the daily lives, their work. But for experts, and maybe if you read it carefully, the documents, a lot of details, a lot of like how to do, what they have done and how they achieve that. For example, carbon intensity. China's carbon intensity in 2020 was 18.8% lower than that in 2015. So a better result than its own target. And of course, it's also better than its commitment to the international community like in 2005. So, the drop in carbon intensity translates to a total reduction of about 5.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions in 5 years' time in 2005 to 15 years to 2020. So, Changhua, tell us, what is the carbon intensity, the achievement by the Chinese side? How significant is it?
It is very significant. Let me sort of, as you said, actually, there were many numbers. Probably people could easily get lost if you don't really follow the policy-making targets, things like that on a daily basis. Let me try my best to sort of summarize it for you. I think you could probably look at the numbers grouped into roughly 3 sort of segments. One I call like a decoupling. As you mentioned, the carbon intensity is an important indicator or goal of that. What does that mean? That means actually efficiency, productivity, right? To make sure, for every unit or whatever unit of GDP produced, and we'll be able to reduce actually the carbon emission and also energy, consumption there. The numbers tell you very strong story for instance, even in the last sort of 5 years. And the Chinese GDP annual growth was about 5.7%. Then if you look at the energy consumption, it's down. It's only at a growth at actually about 2.8%. That's a major decoupling. If you look at actually carbon emissions there, so while the Chinese GDP has pretty much growing like 4 times in the last 15 years or so, then if you look at the carbon intensity during the same period of time, Chinese carbon intensity has been down actually for almost actually 50%. It's about 48.5% there. So those numbers tell you strongly how the country has been pursuing actually reducing the carbon emissions through decoupling efforts there. The second segment is about switching from coal to non-fossil fuels there. That's why you started to see like the coal numbers actually in the energy sector continues to decrease. If you look at the last year, China's 49% of the Chinese electricity generated from coal. And compared to 15 years ago, that was about 72% there, right? Dramatically down. Then, so where do we switch to? Switch now fossil fuel energy, particularly solar and wind and others. Now we have more solutions about electrification, about hydrogen, of course, beyond nuclear and others there. I call it non-fossil fuels there. The third one actually is about nature. I call it nature-based solutions or natural architecture, particularly emphasizing the forest, right? Carbon sink, not only for the sake of carbon sinking, but also actually to preserve nature and protect biodiversity there. So those are the 3 major sort of segments of numbers. And then of course they're more detailed about, like industry, transportation, building, stuff like that. So you could have a better understanding how the country has been going about actually to deliver the decarbonization agenda. Very fundamentally, looking into the future, I think one fundamental piece of the puzzle is the national energy system that's going to be redesigned, reshaped away from fossil fuel, particularly coal-based, towards non-fossil fuel based there. This is system change. It has to be an integrated sort of national strategy to drive system change. That's why actually the white paper has laid out not only the numbers in terms of the time-bound targets, but very, very importantly to tell people and to tell the rest of the world how the country is really to organize itself with these two targets, carbon, capping emissions before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060, really at the core of the policy-making process to really fundamentally drive the transition. And so I think at that point it needs to be really understood. Going to COP26, this is exactly the level of details that's needed, for countries coming together, put their commitments together, looking into the next 2 or 3, 4 decades there, but not just saying the numbers. You need to provide convincing, credible, reliable evidence and the strategy and periodic milestones actually to deliver that. I think from that perspective, China has definitely done a great job.
Well, a follow-up question, Changhua, how likely is the Chinese experience and the Chinese approaches to be shared with other developing countries or other countries, with also the similar intention to reduce the reliance on the fossil fuel and also, of course, with the sake of fighting climate change?
Sure, I mean, China is already sharing with others, not only through the multilateral process, but also China has created its own, putting money to work with other countries through this South-South Climate Partnership, as well as the Green Belt Road Initiative there. Particularly, if you look at the recent decision, the government has decided to stop, overseas investment in coal power plants, instead actually redirecting that sort of finance to invest in low carbon renewable energy in developing countries there. So China not only say, just talk about it, write a paper, write a story to share about it, rather through South-South collaboration process, helping developing countries building up their expertise capability. But in the meantime, actually using vehicles, particular BRI, as the vehicle to invest, in alternative, energy there to make sure the access to clean energy and energy security in many other developing countries there. That's another sort of role model China has set for the rest of the world as well.
Briefly, Changhua, what do you expect out of this upcoming COP26?
That's a very difficult story, and many people started already saying it's going to be more difficult than the Paris agreement process. And the goals set getting into COP26, I think there are 4 major goals set by the UK presidency. One, of course, to make sure keep alive 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the agreement, in the multilateral process. Secondly, actually more like paying more attention to investing in adaptation at the local level, as well as natural habitat protection, the nature level there as well. The third is mobilizing financing, and the last, of course, some details, modalities in the Paris Agreement and negotiations there. So far, I think we definitely gonna fail in the financing side because just yesterday, Germany and Canadian government came out because they were tasked by UK to lead this climate delivery sort of platform. Now the timeline, they're looking into 2023 to deliver this $100 billion every year, committed more than a decade ago by developing country to supporting developing countries. So that's definitely going to fail. Secondly, actually, if you look at the 1.5 degrees, I think the UK government has probably emphasized a little bit too much actually on that, rather than paying more attention to see how to deliver the 2 degrees at first, of course, aiming towards 1.5 degrees. The nature side adaptation is complicated because so far there's no successful or sustainable, financing model to invest in adaptation. And so far, I think that's going to require lots of attention. So I wouldn't say it's going to be a success. It's an international process necessary that we have to go through. But somehow you cannot put all the, your eggs in that basket. And that's going to be just a part of the process to moving forward. By the way, I think definitely COVID-19 pandemic has complicated that situation as well. That's why it's been delayed. And of course, it's getting more complicated in terms of finance, support, stuff like that. So we'll see what will come in. I will watch very closely to the process, and hopefully somehow we'll be able to see something more constructive coming out of the COP26.
Well, John, one thing, of course, there's a lot of achievement, obviously, in China's pursuit of this green economy, green energy. But at the same time, as recent, the case of energy shortage shows, like there's an issue, how to push forward the development of green energy, renewable energy, at the same time, the reliance on the traditional and fossil fuel. How to balance this, at the same time you want to develop the economy, right? This is really a delicate balance.
Absolutely. I think the recent events illustrate the daunting task and the complexity of achieving that goal. I think, ultimately we have to keep in mind that, it's a very lofty goal, it's a pompous goal, and we all understand it. But, this goal cannot be compromised at the cost of, really impacting people's daily life, at the cost of hampering our economic development. And I think we did, we learned some good lessons here just for the last few weeks, that it's indeed something quite difficult, and we shouldn't overpromise to the international community, and we should be doing this sort of in a very delicate and very careful manner. My sense is that we probably overestimate the difficulty and the challenges lying ahead, and I guess some government ministries and some government officials will probably go ahead and do these things without taking into consideration of the broader impact, the broader implications for the economy and for people's daily life. And I think we probably should do a better planning job, should probably do a better coordination job. I think we learned this lesson, and thank goodness that Premier Lee came out and said that he's stopping these measures to rectifying and remedying the recent difficulties we're experiencing. So I still have a lot of faith in the current administration, and that I think these are the goals. Now we still have some maneuvering room here. I mean, these are the goals for 2030 and 2060. There are different ways of getting there. And again, I would emphasize that we should not do these things by compromising the basics of running the economy and the basics of people's daily life. I mean, these are the common sense things we have to keep in mind.
A very delicate balance there. Now we have Isabel Hilton, CEO of China Dialogue. Isabel, welcome to the show. Again, similar question here. Not only in China we see this kind of a power shortage, but also in the European market, we see this basically natural gas crisis. Also in the U.S., you see the inflation, the high prices of this power over there. Is it a temporary thing, or is it going to have a long-term impact on our fight against the climate change?
Well, I think it's pretty much a temporary thing. We are looking at disruptions caused by COVID. We are looking at a global recovery from a really serious crisis. And of course, the market is functioning. It's having to react very quickly. It doesn't react quickly enough, and you get distortions such as this. But I think one important lesson from this is that renewables are not subject to these stresses. So the larger your share of renewable energy in domestic supply, the less you are subject to market volatility, and that's going to matter a great deal. I think that those are the lessons that countries that understand energy vulnerability will draw from this, and I think that these tensions will be relatively short-lived.
And now we are seeing, in California, the diesel-powered generators are ordered basically to run, non-stop or to avoid any blackouts. And in Germany, people are talking about probably the biggest emission in 30 years because of the use of coal. Hopefully that will be a short term. Some people would say, oh, that's because we are too aggressive in pursuing this green energy, renewable energy or green economy. What's your response to that kind of criticism?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of being too aggressive. I think that it is. We have been in a hugely disrupted market. And you see the same phenomena in China. I see from my South China Morning Post that diesel generators are also running to keep Chinese factory production up. So I think we're all in the same boat as far as that goes. And it will cause an unfortunate spike in emissions, but I think a short-term one. if you look at the delivery that renewables have made of primary energy in most places, it's much higher than it was before the pandemic. So we're not looking at a failure of renewable energy. We're looking at distortions in the market of and the supply of fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, as you said, in the Chinese situation, similar situation as in the European market, the power shortage over there. Talked about the government's efforts to ensure, the manufacturing, the production, because they're the daily lives you have to take care of the people. Do you think the business community in China is following the governments in terms of implementing all those actions and plans to achieve those goals?
Well, companies do their own things. I mean, they have a target they have to meet, they have to survive, they have to operate, they have to maximize profits. All companies do that. But I think one lesson that I think it's worth mentioning here is that sometimes government officials go out and try to implement these policies and try to meet their goals. But the example you mentioned, for example, companies go out and buy these diesel engines to generate electricity. That's just even more polluting. That's even worse, I guess. I think government officials need to keep that in mind, that sometimes even on the book, they seem to appear to have reached their goal. But if you look at the real pollution out there, right? What's the good use of it if people go out and buy diesel engines to generate electricity? That doesn't sound right to me. I mean, that's even more polluting. It's not going to be captured by the statistics, not in their books. But they're creating pollutions out there. So I think we need to do this in a more clever way, a smarter way, and look at the things sort of more in a systematic approach, as opposed to just standing from its own little position and try to meet minister level targets. That's just not right.
John, of course, we would love to see more and more renewable energy, as soon as possible, as much as possible. What's blocking the development? Is it about the technology transfer? Is it about the lack of innovation? Or is it about the lack of investment, for example, globally?
I think primarily, from my understanding, is more of a technology issue. And I mean, your solar and wind, they are good energy sources, but you can't have a very large percentage of these things in your total grid capacity, because these are fluctuating and subject to some weather changes. I think in particular in this year's situation, my understanding in Northeast China, for example, it is the extreme weather conditions that's limiting the capacity from these sources. So I think we're all waiting for the wonderful technology of storage capacity, storage technologies. In other words, when you have more storage technology, energy storage technologies, the grid itself can be more accommodating to these types of energy sources that are more subject to weather conditions, that are more fluctuating on a daily basis. The evolution towards a 100% carbon neutrality, renewable energy sources scenario has to be conducted in a phased approach. We are basically racing against time. We're racing together with technological advancements, we can't get ourselves ahead of time. And we're clearly learning the lessons here for the last few months. That too much of a I like to, and I hate to use the word great forward, okay, but it seems to me it probably is not a great forward, but it's probably a little forward in terms of achieving that goal. We just have to be very practical and not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay, so Isabel, the COP26, people see this is the most important meeting since Paris Agreement in 2015 and the most consequential one. So what's your expectation out of this important summit?
Gosh, well, we're all quite nervous at this point, I think, because, a great deal hangs on this. We're not negotiating a new agreement. That's, we have the Paris Agreement. But this is the moment when we have to make the Paris Agreement work. And to make the Paris Agreement work, all countries have to raise their ambition. That was embedded in the Paris Agreement. We're already a year late because of the pandemic, but this is the moment when countries have to put on the table a set of ambitions that will take us to 1.5. It's 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement, but the general consensus now, particularly after the assessment report on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees and the terrible damage we're already seeing just at 1.1 degree of warming, I think that the global consensus now, and certainly from things like the small island states, is that 1.5 is absolutely go beyond that, and it's not safe. So we have to emerge from Glasgow with a reasonable prospect of meeting that target, and that is a great challenge.
What's the specific expectation for developed world and for developing countries? For example, they have different responsibilities and different plans probably. And I know just now Changhua mentioned about probably we will fail to see that rich countries the financing $100 billion a year climate finance for the global south to deal with climate change. So what is why probably we are going to see the failure?
Well, I think that's certainly that 100 billion is disappointing. There has been a new proposal in the last couple of days that, again, the promise to reach it in another couple of years, and it's very disappointing because it sends the wrong message, if you like, to the lower middle income countries. However, the fact is that 100 billion, though it has a very high symbolic value and it has a very high kind of emotional value for the negotiations, it would make relatively little difference, to be honest. What really matters is moving the trillions which are, the public and the private investment in new energy systems that have to go into particularly emerging economies. And that is both more promising and more challenging because there are many different factors that you have to line up to move those investments. It's partly about risk, it's partly about the cost of capital to emerging economies in poorer countries. It's partly about having really valid and good projects in which to invest. But that is really what is going to make the difference. And I think we will see, quite a lot of work is being done on green finance and how to move the world's investment in the right direction. And I think that we will see some progress there. It is disappointing about the 100 billion. And I think there's very little defense for that. We have been, through a pandemic and all economies are disrupted. But nevertheless, it's a very disappointing signal. But I think if we can get progress on how we mobilize the world's finance, mobilizing the trillions, is what's really going to change things.
Mm-hmm. Well, China, not long ago has basically made a promise, not to finance coal-fired plants anymore, overseas coal-fired plants. How big a thing is that? How big a promise is that?
Well, we were all very, very pleased to see that. I think that China was, if you like, following a trend because there had been a lot of cancellations of proposed projects in host countries, and in Bangladesh and in Pakistan and in Vietnam. Countries had looked at the prospect of being locked into a high carbon development pathway and essentially building stranded assets. And many, many institutions had decided no longer to finance coal. So I think it was a very good decision for China to join that trend, and it will make a big difference. But the more important part was that China promised to support
Isabel.
countries.
I have to stop you there. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for watching. See you next time.